Okay, today I'm joined by Doran Pennington, as always, and a very special guest, somebody I've been looking forward to speaking with since the conception of the podcast. Three-time World Barista Championship loser, the lead author on a 2014 paper published in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry with me, co-author of Water for Coffee, my oldest friend, the newest dad, Maxwell Dashwood.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Chris, for that wonderful intro. I mean, you missed a few things out, but we can get onto those later.
Tell me, what did I miss? What did I miss? Which ones did I miss?
Well, there's a few, you know, my latest book, The Business of Specialty Coffee.
Oh, yeah, I have that somewhere.
Popped out. You should have that. You might have read a little bit of that, or at least spotted your name in the back.
I actually didn't read it. Yeah.
You're not the my typical reader that I'm aiming for. Although I'd love it if you read even a chapter. That'd be great.
I will. Also, everybody who's listening to this podcast is your typical reader, and they should go and read this book, purchase this book.
Yeah, well, I did, when you started this podcast up, I thought how relevant it is to people doing business in coffee, because so much of what we do is trying to understand how to make a better product or trying to understand how people engage with coffee. And so I think there is a lot of business application to your podcast series.
Yeah, well, I'm notoriously bad at business, as you know, so that's I should probably read it, and I should probably read, you know, other books that you've got. You've also got the Coffee Dictionary.
The Coffee Dictionary is in 8 languages now. It's about to go into Simple Chinese and Hungarian. But it's a very that book was fun. It's, you know, it's quite light, but I like writing. I like a writing project, which, you know, as you know, that comes and goes in waves. It's difficult because people say to both me, like, oh, you know, when are you going to get Water for Coffee 2 finished? And I start to make excuses about me and you and the things I'm doing in my life, the things you're doing in your life, and the fact that you now live in Oregon and I live in the UK, and we've got the time difference and all these different projects. But I think when you can find the time to do writing projects alongside the other things, I actually find them very enjoyable. And I really love the way people out in the world engage with something that's a written piece of work.
Well, yes. So when is Water for Coffee 2 coming out?
I'll bat that right back at you. When are you going to finish writing your half of Water for Coffee 2, Chris?
Fair enough. Well, let me put it this way. I told people at the SCA that we would have a completed draft to the people that need to have it by August 1st.
Okay, it's first I've heard of this deadline, but I like it.
Ambitious.
I mean, I think if we get it out this year, I'll be thrilled.
Oh, it's coming out this year. I can't have lingering writing projects on my desk.
It's coming out this year because Chris got roasted for not having the book published yet.
Yeah, he is. He doesn't want that. I mean, it's a double-edged sword, or a silver lining, so to speak, is that this has taken us far too long. We wrote the original book in 2015. It's almost a decade ago. We only actually printed it and ran and sold printed copies for maybe 3 years.
Yeah.
And so it's been out of print a long time, but I actually, you know, I'm not going to say it was intentional to just drag it out like this, but it's been a good thing because it means there's a lot of other people coming to the table, thinking about water, talking about water. So there's actually more to think about and write about now than if we'd have followed up with an amended version back in, say, 2018.
Yeah, and honestly, people have challenged a lot of the stuff in the original book, and it's made our understanding of the topic better. People have also like commercialized products surrounding water chemistry for coffee brewing, and that has made better coffee. I think overall, maybe you and I probably know a fair bit more, and we can actually be a little more prescriptive now about like, oh, you know, it turns out that you want harder water for espresso, and you care maybe less as a target about the metal ions and more about the bicarbonate if you're just trying to get a first approximation of good.
The original book was very much posing some big questions, and now we can give some more practical guidelines of what the industry seems to have sort of coalesced on and agrees on. So I think it's exciting. I'm excited about that book for sure, and to see it go out into the world again.
We have preliminary experiments happening in the lab right now that are showing that the solubility of different organic molecules depends on the salts that you use. Wow. And that this is going to be a big one. I mean, it's probably not, those experiments will take longer than the book, but we'll allude to them in the book. But basically the idea is that, you know, if you try and extract caffeine, for example, in one mineral rich water, you can only get so much of it. If you use a different mineral rich water, you might get even more of it. And that's probably true to, you know, different extents based on different molecules. So I think some of the concepts that we were talking about back in the day probably are actually going to be supported by some careful experiments that we've been doing.
Well, I think you had an idea for a chapter I really liked, which was, look, the research of this topic can go on and on and on, and there's some very short term to medium term experiments that you could work on and could be done. But how about a chapter that talks about how do we go about experimentally approaching some of these concepts and ideas that haven't properly been tested in water yet?
Yeah.
And so,
well, so just to build on that, a lot of the experiments that people have done to sort of either validate or invalidate, depending on what their hypothesis was, the value of calcium versus magnesium, which seemed to be what most people took away from our book in the first version of it. A lot of those discussions were like, well, okay, let's go run fancy chromatographic measurements and then see if we can see differences with mass spec. But you're looking for a needle in a haystack there. You're looking for like what drives a flavor of blueberry versus strawberry is like very minor fluctuations in things. It's going to be really hard to make that measurement. But if you go at it a different way and think about a different type of experiment, instead of like thinking about the salt as the control and everything else kept constant, and instead trying to emphasize a situation where the salt really highlights or amplifies its effect, that's a good way to say then, well, that probably happens at a lesser extent in the cup. But
yeah, you can back solve it. And say, look, I mean, possibly. I mean, obviously, someone could quite argue, rightly argue that, dosage is key in many areas of science. But yeah, absolutely.
Okay, but you said you got a few other things that I missed in your intro. What else did I miss?
Well, obviously, Colonna Coffee, they got the roastery and the two shops, and then I work on a few other sort of innovation projects. I work with a company called Creatic up in Yorkshire, who's an ex-biotech guy who hated biotech because of all the litigation and the high stakes of that world, but loves coffee. And so one of the big projects we've been doing is working on a new grinding technology, which we're licensing to a coffee manufacturer to bring to life. But there's a bunch of interesting things we do up there, and I think what's interesting about running a roastery in a coffee shop is you want to understand the scientific approach to making a great product and all these questions we have that pop up month in, month out. Sometimes you might not have any scientific questions in your coffee business for 6 months, and then for some reason to do with a certain coffee or a certain brewing method, it becomes something you need to focus on. But I actually think in a great coffee shop, you're just trying to make great coffee every single day, and it's a lot about repeating something and crafting it to a high level. That side project for me is a nice way for me to explore that more creative, sort of curious side of all the questions that still need to be answered in coffee. And I think there's two sides where we see a lot of this, right? Pure academic research like yourself, which is saying there's no commercialization directly here. This is just about answering questions that we have. And then there's that where it crosses over with the commercialization, where we learn through commercializing some of those concepts and ideas. So yeah, I feel very lucky that I've been able to collaborate with people like yourself and be involved in these interesting projects.
Well, I want to talk about the two shops for a second. So you started out with Colonna and Smalls in Bath, which is in the southwest of the UK. You also have the new shop, which is on Eastern London on Leather Lane. Typically, when people think about specialty cafes, certainly in England, I have the personal experience with this. I think of London as being absolutely a coffee city. There's a ton of cafes, great cafes, a lot of good coffee in London. Bath is not London. It is a destination cafe in the sense that this is a beautiful city that is far away from London. It's an hour and a half on a train.
It might as well be 8 hours, yeah.
Like in America, people will drive an hour and a half in LA just to get from one side to the other side of LA. So opening the second cafe in London obviously is catching a new collection of people probably. My question to you is this, is how many clients do you have that you see in both shops semi-regularly?
A surprisingly high amount. Bath, in my opinion, is a nicer place to live than London. I know people adore and love London. This is a very personal thing about where people like to live.
Yeah.
Some people find somewhere like Bath a bit too small, and somewhere like London's got a lot going on. I think a lot of that happened in COVID as well. People wanting to move out of somewhere like London. And so, it's not great for rent or property prices in Bath for me. They've all gone up. But there's a lot of people who work a bit in London and live in Bath. And there is this interesting connection there. To your question about London, it's really, you said there's a reason we've opened there for sure. Like, I love being in Bath. And when we started there wasn't really, we chose somewhere that we thought had, was an interesting city. It had the two universities. A lot of the local industry is sort of creative, internet-based industries or content. You've got GCN, who are a global cycling network, like a YouTube cycling content business. You've got quite a diverse local economy. But then you've also got all the tourism, and
oh yeah, it's nuts. It's crazy.
It's a lot of tourists. A lot of people are going there for the Georgian architecture, the Roman baths, and the Jane Austen centre.
Yeah.
But then they can tack on to come and see us, because you said you wouldn't just go from London to Bath for a coffee, right? But you would go to Bath for a couple of days, and why not come and see us?
Or even a day trip to go see the Roman baths, which is perhaps one of the best archaeological activities I've ever done. And you go there for like that for an hour, then you go to Colonna and Smalls next door, and you've just had a good day. Like, this is objectively a good day.
Totally. And so with all of those pros, London's still London. It's still the center of a lot of industry in the UK, and coffee's no different. There you've got your green trading companies, you've got your showrooms for your equipment manufacturers, their head offices, you've got a ton of roasters and coffee shops. And so it is a real center of something. And actually, I love the Bath shop to bits. It's got a special place in my heart. It turns 14 years old this year.
Wow.
But it's crazy, right? That has flown by. But there's also, London's a special place for us to be as well. And I think what's interesting is I've noticed the appreciation of what we try to do as a business in London so far has been very high. Like, there's a lot of people in the capital who are mad about coffee and, kind of share our approach and interest. So that's been really rewarding.
So in the US, as you know, their destination cafes have a different embodiment. They're not exactly the same because people don't have a train access. So there could be like a destination in a funny suburb of a big city, and you drive out there, or one that you'd be familiar with, Maxwell. Proud Mary out of Melbourne, Australia, has two branches here. One is in Portland, Oregon, and the other one is in Austin, Texas. And in that sense, the way that I think coffee companies make their decisions about where they open cafes is more about like the culture of the city rather than rather than being a destination per se. It's more the fact that it already was a destination. They're now choosing to open up something in that destination.
That basically sounds exactly kind of, whether I thought about it that way or not, that's kind of how Bath worked for us, right?
You were talking about the Roman baths. Is that why the town is called Bath?
I believe it is, yeah. I feel like I should know more about Bath than I do. But I often listen. There's lots of people who do free walking tours or paid walking tours. Bath. There's a lot to look at and a lot to know.
Yeah.
Well, you never know how accurate these walking tours are, because we get some that go by the coffee lab every day, and they say the wildest stuff about what we do.
They make it up. They have no idea what we're doing.
Go on, what do they say?
A lot of it is we're trying to make the perfect espresso, and that we serve espresso for free every day to anyone who asks. That's one.
Yeah. Perfect.
We also have gotten that we're doing electrons. So at least someone has made the connection that, like, hey, they have like electrodes around, so that's probably something with electricity, so that must be important.
But this is I mean, this is kind of like classic great PR, right? Which is just letting the story run. Like
oh, well, people got so mad at us when the triboelectrification paper came out, because all the headlines were not about fracturing and charging and stuff. They were all like, scientists have found a perfect way to make coffee. And people would be in the comments of these articles like yelling. And then we were like, that's not even what we said.
Yeah, totally. You'd think people would realize that that wasn't your direct quote, right? But
indeed. Nah, whatever. Screw it.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. It's not like they're saying, Chris Hendon is dumb as the title. so as long as we maintain, relatively positive, I'm fine with it. It's good. Okay. Next question for you, Maxwell. People have seen a media shift in your social media presence from you wearing long sleeve shirts and pulling shots of espresso to you wearing short shorts and lifting heavy objects.
Which is a natural evolution of everyone in coffee, right?
Well, yeah, I guess.
There's some dogs, and now there's some baby chucked in there as well. But
there's dogs, yeah.
Yeah, the weightlifting thing, a lot of people did look at me. They were a bit perplexed by it. Some people loved it. Some people laughed. Other people sent me encouraging messages to say they just thought it was the best thing they'd ever seen. Keep doing it.
So there's this subculture on social media where people who are doing exercise and posting videos of themselves doing exercise have a following of people who get inspired by seeing people doing exercise and lifting heavy things. And even if they're not at the level of fitness that you're at, they still like get motivated to want to go out and like meet their goals. which is good. So it's cool that you're like hitting that market, I suspect.
Well, I think I often tell the story that my interest in getting into lifting was, just to be clear, this isn't the Colonna social media. This is my
this is the Maxwell
personal...
Dashwood.
I don't know how the other people in the company would feel about it on the Colonna platform.
To be fair, you've actually, I just want to challenge you a little bit. I've seen you lifting bags of coffee on the Colonna platform.
Oh yeah, well that's the perfect crossover, right? The Venn diagram. That's where everything in my life aligns. And I did want to run a coffee roasting Olympics, which had a lot of interest, and so I will try and do that at some point.
Will you be wearing clothing, or are you going old school Olympics?
Oh, I see. Yeah. I think we have to wear some form of clothing.
Okay. Yeah, those burlap sacks can really get going on you if you're not careful.
So back to your question though about I actually got into lifting heavy things. I think it was like therapeutic or some need to have a competitive outlet after I retired from coffee competitions.
Okay, so one of the critical things is every time I see you're on a different diet, sometimes it's like no carbs, sometimes it's like 100% carbs. I don't know what are you doing now? What's the situation?
So I started lifting heavy things, and then I quite like competition as a focus point to work towards something. So I took part in some national powerlifting championships. I got to the point where I got a silver in the British championships.
How many people get silver, by the way? Is this a participation award, or is this a...
No. That is second place, right? So...
I'm just checking.
Yeah, it's better. I was just pleased not to be fifth again, which is what I always seem to get at the World Championships.
I was going to ask. Yeah,
like a lot of other people in coffee, I remember when I last caught up with James Hoffman, who's the listeners will probably know who he is. This very successful YouTuber and coffee figure who's done lots in coffee. He's also very interested. He was having very high amounts of protein, trying to maximize his muscle mass. I think he's 44 now. Because you look at these studies saying, okay, longevity is directly associated with grip strength and skeletal muscle mass, as well as VO2 max. And so a lot of people in that space would argue exercise trumps everything, trumps diet, and then these are all the debates that are happening. So I became fascinated by longevity. And so I transitioned away from like this scientific approach to curiously trying to understand coffee, and sort of it seemed to apply into this area of health and well-being.
So in the name of maximizing performance, gaining a competitive edge, have you ever put anything in your butt?
Not in the name of competitive performance. That is a good transition as to why you've selected me to be the guest on this particular podcast, because I am very interested in the academic literature in the health space, and I think there's a lot of crossover with coffee, like this whole like longevity wellness piece about basically like how to biohack and live the best, like fittest, most athletic life, right?
So finally, this brings us to the paper that we're going to talk about. Okay. So Maxwell, I have sent you a paper published in the journal Medicine. It's an open access journal. The article was published in the year 2020. The title is The Safety and Effectiveness of Self-Administered Coffee Enema. And this is a systematic review of case reports. Critically, in the title, this is a self-administered enema.
I thought about this a bit because I'm like, why have they determined that it's for that? And I think it's because I think in most cases enemas are self-administered, unless you're going in to have an X-ray or something and to clear the bowel. Most of the application of enemas is done by the individual in their home, right?
Most enemas are done self-administered if they're made with water, but it turns out that most coffee enemas are actually done in sort of like naturopathic medicinal environments where there's going to be some doctor who's pumping you full of this coffee. Now, the thing is that this paper actually tries to review all reports that have talked about coffee and enema and self-administered, and it does a sorting activity.
Yeah, so this is a meta-analysis. So they're not doing any original work in this paper. They're kind of surveying the existing scientific literature and seeing if they can draw any conclusions that would be difficult to make from one specific case study. So like Chris was saying, they did a search on 11,000 something articles. They found about 300 that were potentially relevant, but of those, 157 were not self-administered, 88 were not coffee enema specific, and 45 had unreported clinical outcomes. And then they slotted in a little manual search somehow additional to this database search and found 2 papers.
Yeah.
So,
I guess that means that they just started Googling some stuff.
I think they were like, hey, a buddy of mine told me about this one. So
that is how this stuff goes sometimes. Yeah.
And so 9 articles met the study criteria, and the criteria were just, do they answer the following questions? And the questions are designed so that you can get a thorough understanding of the treatment, the patient, the outcome, and so on.
People typically don't publish articles about things they put up their butt unless something either really good happens or something really bad happens. So that's going to sort of lead you into what we're going to talk about today. In medicine, it's actually quite common to publish a paper with a clinical trial and then you report the result of that. Or you publish a case study where something tremendously good or tremendously bad happened. Today's article is a summary of how tremendously bad for you a coffee enema can be.
That's what I took as the overarching lesson, which, and to be honest, I went from reading, this topic obviously has humorous subtext to it.
Sure.
But I must be honest, as I was reading the paper, I went from, sort of casually finding the humorous side into it to being sort of quite appalled, really, and feeling very sad for certain individuals who felt that this was an alternative therapy to solve, a chronic disease or illness. So
let me give a little bit of background here, just so that we're all on the same page. An enema, sometimes referred to as a colonic irrigation, sometimes is administered recreationally. There's a sub community that will do this regularly. This paper is not necessarily dealing with the purpose of it, but rather the outcome of the exercise of administering coffee via the rectum. The idea here is they talk about an ideal brew method. The coffee has to be extremely lightly roasted. So the brew ratio is pretty dilute as well. It's going to be like 3 tablespoons, which is, I don't know how much, probably like 40 grams to a liter.
1 liter, yeah.
So yeah, 40 grams per liter, boiled for 15 minutes, and it's really, really light.
I mean, I've got a cup here.
Yeah.
I actually made it in the cafe, and it's very, very light. Like,
yeah.
It is like a sandy light brown. It smells very nutty. Right, it's sort of like bird feed.
There's a bit of history to this, and please indulge me for a moment so I can explain the origin of this. In the 1920s, there was this doctor named Dr. Gerson, and he had, I believe the story goes, a sick wife, and she had some, I can't remember which sort of cancer, but he developed this multifaceted way of approaching her health. And one of the things, besides taking vitamins and doing all these other things, one of the things that was prescribed by him to his wife was regular coffee enemas 2 times a day, where you would put relatively high volume, over 500 milliliters, into your rectum. And she seemingly recovered from the cancer that was plaguing her. And so that laid the foundation for the development of what is now known as the Gerson Institute. This is a registered organization. This is a not-for-profit organization. You can go online and look them up. And the Gerson Institute is sort of like, I'd say, the bastion, the front runner in advocating for the coffee enema. On the website, you can buy all sorts of things. So they have books on the sort of best practices for administering coffee to yourself. In fact, one of the books is called 3,000 Coffee Breaks. There's also other products, and we're going to come to the other products in just a minute.
But the origin of just an enema goes much further back, right? Like,
yes, exactly.
It's been done for a long, long time.
Maxwell, why do people do this? Tell me the effect. What happens? Do you know?
Well, I think, today in the world we live in, it's most commonly prescribed to people for constipation and cleaning their bowel. Obviously, it gets more specific about treating very severe conditions. But if you go back in time, it was thought to cure all sorts of ailments and illnesses.
Yeah.
And so it's got a long history. And then, like you say, the coffee bit is much more recent.
Everyone's probably listening to this podcast going, are they going to do it? The answer is no, because I read the scientific literature, and we're going to review this
in a minute. Yourself, Chris.
No, well, if you did it and you also read this paper, you're maybe unhelpable. But okay, but the thing is if you pump a little bit of water into your rectum, even if the water doesn't you can imagine what you think that water is doing. You can think it traverses all 20 feet of your small and large intestine, surrounding pieces of feces and then helping them move through. That's not what happens at all. In fact, the water doesn't go that far. I mean, there's some studies about the kinetics of this. It ends up going like, it goes in a bit, but what ends up happening is it stimulates your bowel to start moving. And so inevitably some water goes in, and then you'll defecate, and you'll be, and so then the original idea was, okay, if there's caffeine in there, that might further stimulate this process, right? That was the idea.
A lot of those patients were doing it for different reasons and have very different health backgrounds, right? It's not like, you know, lots of people who have been asked to take part who first got screened to all be sort of healthy individuals to go off and do a coffee enema and see how it goes. There was often a wide range of specific reasons that these individuals were having an enema, which also potentially leads into the problems with the data of saying, well, how much of it was their pre-existing health condition versus the actual use of a coffee enema. So it's quite a challenging thing to do a meta-analysis on, right?
Yeah, and this does kind of get to the point of the Gerson Institute's existence, which is this is not a thing that's just generally prescribed to live healthily. You know, it's not one of those things where like, oh, drink some green tea every once in a while. This is kind of targeted for people with severe chronic terminal illnesses.
Right. And so there are some case studies that we're going to talk about that are not that. There are some people that were in fine health, and this reports their response there. There were some people that were obviously in very, very poor health and were basically trying things to prolong their life and keep them alive. And all right, as we're about to go into this, I want to have a disclaimer moment. You can and may put anything in your ass you want. But as I was thinking about this last night, I think 20% of things on Earth that you put in your ass will not be that problematic. Just 20% of objects. Think of an object. If it goes in your butt, you're going to be okay. 80% of objects will get you into like a meme on Reddit. The problem here is that a normal enema, water enema, is actually, I'd put that in the 20% of things that are not going to generally be so bad for you. It's not clear that coffee enema is in that 20% of things that can go in your butt that will not cause problems. So let's get into this. Maxwell, they present a table 2, which is the study ID, which is a reference to the original research article, the patient details, the intervention, which is they gave themselves an enema and how much coffee they put in themselves, the results, and the conclusions from the authors in that paper. Maxwell, which ones jumped out at you? Anyone on that list there?
I mean, there's the Isel and Rie 1980 paper.
Yep.
Where
good one.
The 46-year-old female patient and the 37-year-old patient as well. And, you know, it's sort of the worst possible outcome. You know, both patients died, right?
They administered a coffee enema several times at high frequency.
And on the high frequency piece, right? Like when you look at application of the suggested therapeutic rate, some practitioners of this, it's like incredibly frequent, right?
Yeah,
like,
so I was about to say the pain patient did it 10 to 12 times per hour.
It's incredible. Yeah.
And the cancer patient did it 4 times a day with 1 liter of coffee. So, okay, so these are, you get the idea. These are pretty high volumes. The outcome was both of these people died. So that's not good.
What was the time frame? Do we have that of how long?
It's in the original article. I didn't look at that in so much detail, but these people were obviously both very sick. I mean, when the younger person had breast cancer that metastasized into lymph nodes, and I mean, they were obviously in very bad health. So, you know, sometimes when I read these papers, I sometimes imagine when I see these sentences in here, the author or someone else reading it to me, and I just have in my mind my PhD advisor reading this to me saying,
pain patient. Experienced grand seizures followed by cardiorespiratory arrest.
All right, Doran, give me another one.
Okay, my personal favorite is Kem et al. 2012, 27-year-old woman experiencing constipation. The thing that I noticed from this is, you know, I'm not a biologist. I don't really interact with the health field at all. I don't know what a lot of these words mean. But when you see these words together, necrotic mucosal lesions in the rectum, you kind of know that's bad news. And if you go to that paper, you can see for yourself the necrotic mucosal lesions.
Yeah. So in that particular study, they sent an endoscope up that young woman's rectum, and they basically revealed that the process of giving herself a coffee enema put a perforation in her rectum that was 4 centimeters long. And she did not recover for, I think, 180 days.
This was one of the, I think, in you know, trying to understand what the direct cause of these negative side effects, like colitis is a a common side effect, right? And it's sort of saying,
Yeah.
Ulcers inside your bowel, large bowel and rectum. But the question is like, how much of it is to do with heat? Because when I started reading about the heat again and again, I started to be like, oh, maybe this is why the self-administered aspect of this paper is so important.
Well, there is that, but there's also, something interesting is that in the two patients we were talking about earlier that both died, they were doing this a lot and very often. And if you were burning yourself, you wouldn't be able to keep doing that. But the adverse outcomes that they had were the authors conclude that it was because they depleted sodium and chloride from their body.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So they need water for coffee. Lee et al. 2008, 69-year-old male patient experiencing constipation. Self-administered a coffee enema to relieve the constipation. 40 Celsius enema fluid was administered 15 centimeters inside the rectal canal and retained for 20 minutes. There was pain that lasted for 7 days, colitis, which is inflammation of the lower intestine. Then the plausible mechanism for this was they thought that the caffeine and other bioactive compounds in coffee were giving rise to a response that was quite negative. Now, the executive summary so far is, first of all, obviously, do not put hot coffee in your ass. Like, this has got to be one of the dumbest things I've ever heard, because you can't put your hand in the coffee and you have pain receptors in your hand. The reason that this was problematic is because it turns out you don't actually really have pain receptors deep inside your intestines. Like, you have them near your skin, you have them probably around your anus, but you probably do not have them that deep. And so people would hold on to really hot liquid inside themselves and just totally burn out everything. And the images are just terrible. They're really bad. They're the stuff of nightmares. Let's go back to the Gerson Institute for just one moment. On the Gerson Institute website, they will sell you a beginner's kit called the Coffee Break Bundle. And that includes 2 pipes, a book, and a bucket, and 2 bags of coffee. I personally take of all the gross things that I can think about, this bucket is just truly, I don't know what to make of this thing. It turns out the bucket is where you store the coffee before it goes in you. And then these tubes are to like basically siphon the coffee out of the bucket into your rear end. Something jumped out at me when I was looking at this. I was like, I swear to God, I've seen this coffee before. And it turns out it's a coffee that they are endorsing called the Organic Therapy Blend Coffee. And then I looked and I was like, oh my goodness, the roastery happens to be a roastery based out of Eugene, Oregon. There is no way. So I mean, when I saw this, I sent Doran this string of like insane person text messages going, Doran, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened. So what we did is we sourced 5 pounds of the therapy blend, and I've sent you, Maxwell.
You sent me a small sample, yeah.
Enough should you want to have a cup of it followed by an enema. And what we're going to do now is, because you have it in your cup and we've just actually cupped it right here on the table, we're going to taste this and we're going to do a little description. You've already said the cup you were tasting was what? Nutty and
birdseed.
Yeah. Birdseeds. While Doran and I are going to slurp this, why don't you tell us, how did you brew it? What did you do? Did you make espresso with this thing?
No, I did not. No. I mean, I go back to the whole water for coffee thing. Obviously, espresso is a high concentrate beverage. I think it would have been, very acidic. There's actually quite a nice, pleasant acidity at. I brewed it on an AeroPress with some pretty soft water, a coarse grind, like a 3-4 minute brew, which is what I like to do with AeroPresses, just to, mush the coffee up less in the grinder. But I've actually preferred it as it's cooled right down, which is a common thing. Generally, for me, really light roasts, I don't think perform as well when they're hot. Darker roasts do, and then they reverse. So as the light roast cools down, I think it gets a bit more pleasant. The dark roast starts to dry out and taste a lot worse.
So,
but it's not. I don't think it's like an offensive cup of coffee at all. It's very light, lighter than even like your most sort of light Scandi roaster would do.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question. Did I tell you on the bag I sent you the origin of this coffee?
I don't believe you did.
It is a single origin coffee. The question for you is, what is the origin of this coffee?
So this is one of my complaints about really light roasted coffee. I think you make these taste the same. So it's very hard to pick origin, right? That's so, I mean, I think it's a washed coffee, but other than that, I'm like, it's a relatively clean washed coffee. It's hard for me to pick the origin.
Yeah. So this company specializes in exclusively Mexicans from Chiapas.
Oh, is it? Okay.
You could probably use basically any super, super light coffee for this and adhere to what the Gerson Institute is suggesting. Doran.
Yeah, well, given that, I think it's actually really interesting that in the intro to this paper, they present a mechanism that seems quite sophisticated. I mean, like they talk about glutathione S-transferase and how this is activated by the coffee enema because of the compounds like cafestol in coffee, and that increasing the activity of this antioxidant enzyme will neutralize free radicals, and then that will go transfer into your bile and be excreted. Like they have like an actual mechanism, and I'm no physiologist. I don't really know a lot about this field, but you read that and you're like, yeah, okay, sure.
And then you read the paper and you get to section 3.4 with the subheading effectiveness of the self-administered coffee enema. And there is one sentence that says, no studies reported the effectiveness of self-administered coffee enema. So, Max, am I forgetting anything? Is there something else that jumps out at you in this paper?
I think, I found it interesting that there was a suggestion that if it wasn't self-administered, then the downsides are less common. So that was sort of interesting. I'm like, okay, well, if you're going to do it, go and get a practitioner to do it for you. Yeah, exactly.
So Maxwell, I have a thought experiment for you. You have somehow cosmically purchased 1,000 kilograms of this coffee, and you have to sell it at Colonna Coffee. It has to fly off the shelves, and it's make or break time. What tasting notes do you put on the bag?
Doran, do you know I'm anti flavor notes?
Yeah, I know.
I did this. I did a little YouTube video a few years ago, getting people really angry, where I said it sort of divided people when I became sort of questioning flavor notes. But I think from a sales pitch point of view, the story is better than the flavor notes anyway, right? Does it have to be roasted this way, this light? Do I have to try and sell it roasted this light?
Yeah, based on what you've tasted. I mean, this is what you got.
Yeah, think back to the old days of Colonna and Smalls, where you were buying
multi-roasting
cafe, and you decided, hey, I'm going to buy in this therapy blend, and we're going to sell this thing as a specialty product. Which, by the way, this is a specialty coffee. It absolutely is.
It's a clean washed coffee. Like it's not an offensive raw ingredient. It doesn't taste agey.
There's no defects in my cup.
Very, very light.
Yeah. So how are you going to sell it?
I think I'd sell it on, this is a coffee that we brought in that's pushing the, extremes of light roast coffee, right? Which is, you take the green seed and it's not as complex chemically, and then we put it through this roasting process to develop that. And every roaster has their own idea of how to achieve that perfect balance of complexity, where you have roasted the coffee and developed it enough to showcase its character. This is sort of exploring the lower limits of that, and it's probably the lightest roast coffee you've ever had, and you're probably never going to have the opportunity to buy a coffee roasted this light ever again and explore it with a high grade Arabica coffee. And I'm going to do you a great deal on this, and we're going to sell it by the kilo. And if you bundle it every 5 kilos, I'll chuck you in a free bag of geisha.
Free bucket.
Yeah, free bucket, free tubes.
Free bucket, yeah. Yeah.
Free tubes.
It would be interesting. Like you asked me earlier if I brewed it as espresso. Like, could you?
We're gonna go do that like right after we hang up.
Right. What are all the things you could do with brewing espresso in terms of manipulating technique to try and make it as palatable as possible as espresso?
So there's not very much CO2 in this coffee because it wasn't roasted very dark. So it's not going to give you the crema that you're used to, number one. And so I think this coffee is going to fly out of the portafilter. I think no matter how fine you grind it, this is just going to boom. So it's going to be a tough one. All right, look, we've done it. We've said it all. You have more important commitments to handle than sitting here and talking about enemas with me and Doran. I'll just say this. I miss spending basically every morning with you. Grateful for all the time that you've spent with us today, but also over the years. This is a highlight for me. And obviously for Doran, and we're really grateful for it.
It's an absolute pleasure. And it's a privilege for me to be on it. And I'm thrilled to see the podcast. And, I sent you a paper the other day. I think I love this idea of taking a specific paper, and what didn't happen with our water paper, right? Which was earlier you sort of said, what people took from our book. But I think a lot of what people took was the original paper. And I don't think it was just the paper itself. I think companies, and I think this is something that I looked at with the business book, and is often a lot of what we learn about the coffee industry, whether it's a technical point, an economic point, is actually often from marketing, right? It's from someone marketing their product to us, telling us it's a solution to a problem. And what they're doing is educating you on the problem, often falsely. So I think that's kind of what happened with the water paper. But I think there's so many aspects of coffee study where that happens. And I love that this podcast is like, well, let's go all in at the academic end and break those papers open and talk about, how good they are, but also how we could apply them to the industry. So I love what you're doing.
I said what in the butt? I said what in the butt? You want to do it in my butt? In my butt? You want to do it in my butt? In my butt? You want to do it in my butt? In my butt? Let's do it in the butt. Okay.